Hi guys, I hope you're well. As promised, and very late on my side, so I have to apologize. We're going to go over our Learning Unit 6, Theme 3, which is Business Ethics. So that basically closes off our entire module outline for this module. So I'm going to kick off with the first one. So also it's not going to be a very long lecture because the ethics portion of it is very, very small. So the first one we're going to go over is basically the difference between ethics and business ethics. So when we look at ethics itself as a human being and as a person, we want to understand ethics is basically sort of your principles to decide of what is the right behavior and what is the wrong behavior. Basically, it's applicable to sort of all aspects of human life, whether it is your moral philosophy, your different theories that you have in terms of a value system, or any sort of moral principles that you have that basically govern your individual conduct. Okay. And this can be anything from whether it's a personal or a social or a professional context. So it allows you and guides you to make a decision that is either considered morally right or morally wrong based on the different principles that you have. When we look, as sort of example, when we talk about ethics from a human philosophy perspective, you sort of have to decide whether it is right to tell a white lie to avoid hurting someone's feelings, or you determine the fairness of a particular law or a particular policy which affects society. So those are sort of like the examples to give you an indication of what ethics is and what it means. When we look at business ethics in particular, business ethics is a sort of subset of ethics that would address ethical issues and principles within a business environment. So it will focus on the conduct of like people within your organization, within your business, and how they basically conduct themselves. So business ethics basically applies to sort of decisions and actions within a business setting or in operations, whether it's how you interact with, fellow employees or suppliers or any other stakeholders. And it covers areas such as, whether it's your corporate governance, which a lot of corporate customers or corporate organizations now have a complete corporate governance policy, whether it's your corporate social responsibility, so any CSR that you do, maybe you're helping the public, feeding a home, whatever you decide from a CSR side, whether it's ethical marketing or just ethical treatment of, staff and employees. The focus of business ethics is basically applying ethical principles to business practices, to any sort of decision making that you have. So it deals with issues like compliances with the law, how you treat your staff and your fellow employees or fellow co-workers, having transparency in the workplace, and also accountability. If you have a KPI, for instance, ethically, you want to be able to succeed in achieving that on a monthly, annually, quarterly basis. So some examples from this perspective is you want to make sure that as a business, you don't engage in anything that is deceptive in terms of like advertising practices. You also want to implement sort of like policies that prevent insider trading, or you develop a code of conduct for your employees to follow so that you can ensure that they have ethical behavior within the workplace. Okay. Then we want to look at the different principles of ethics. So when we look at moral principles, we want to look at the autonomy of it. And this is basically respecting other people's right to make their own decision within the workplace. Non-maleficence, this is where you are promoting or you're basically avoiding harm to other people. So you try not to harm them. whether it's from a feeling perspective or a physical perspective. Justice, you want to have fairness, you want to have equality. From a fidelity perspective, you want to be as trustworthy and loyal. And veracity is you want to be as truthful as possible. And your moral values, basically, these are your values like, honesty, integrity, compassion. These are sort of the values. And a lot of time, these values are instilled in us, in our childhood, and we sort of take it into our adulthood. So it's a lot of it has to be, with your upbringing and the way that you carry yourself out in the workplace. From a judgment or moral judgment side, we look at assessments or different evaluations on what is right or wrong based on ethical principles within the workplace or different value sets that the workplace has created. When we look at dilemma, it's where there's some sort of conflict between, your principles is telling you one thing, your values is telling you another thing. So you need to basically make a choice between your different obligations. And your moral responsibility is an obligation to act rightly and be accountable for your specific actions. Okay. Then we want to look at how we basically will apply supply chain to apply ethics to supply chain. So when we look at it, we want to look at it from a supplier selection perspective. And we got supplier selection management. So we want to make sure that we choose suppliers that adhere to fair labor practices, environmental regulation, anything from a sourcing perspective, they are upholding that sort of standard. You want to avoid suppliers that's involved in, like a less than minimum wage, maybe child labor or forced labor or any sort of violation in terms of human rights. And you also want to promote diversity. You want to work with suppliers that embrace ethical employment practices. You obviously don't want to work with someone who has a fairly bad reputation, in the industry. Then we go on to product design and development. So you want to sort of look at it where you are designing products that will prioritize, safety, quality, have sustainability for the environment throughout their life cycle. You also want to avoid the use of like harmful materials or substances where it can pose a risk not only to human life, but also to the environment. And you want to consider sort of the social and cultural implications of product design. You want to respect people's different cultural heritages or avoid any sort of cultural, appropriation. So that's where we look at where development of a product comes into play. Then we have manufacturing. So from a manufacturing side, you want to make sure that you have a safe working condition, you have fair treatment of your workers, you want to prevent as much exploitation as possible. As well, you want, whether it be like excessive overtime or low wages or unsafe working environments. And you want to minimize the environmental impact. And you do this by reducing energy consumption, emissions, any sort of waste generation in your production process. And then the last one is your distribution and logistics. So you want to have a fair and equitable distribution of goods so that you can minimize any sort of like disparities and you want to address any sort of economic inequality. You want to be able to optimize your logistics processes so you save the environment, basically, reducing carbon emissions, any sort of congestion, anything from an environmental impact. And you want to avoid practices like price gauging or exploiting vulnerabilities when there's a time of crisis or the time of emergency. I know that's easier said than done. The logistics industry is very high paced and very competitive. So the moment your competitor is seeing sinking, you now start attacking. Unfortunately, it's the way the cookie crumbles, and that's where you see you have a moral judgment question coming on board. Okay, then we want to look at the importance of ethics in supply chain management. Okay, and the first one is you want to build trust, you want to build a reputation. So ethical behavior basically fosters trust. Customers, suppliers, sort of any other stakeholders are more likely to trust companies that have, integrity or transparency or even fairness within their supply chain practices. So you want to do, you want to try and push trust as much as possible, and you want to protect reputation as much as possible. Safeguard the company's reputation, safeguard the brand image, because the market today is very competitive. All you have is your reputation and the trust that you have with your customers. You want to do as much legal compliance as possible. You want to adhere to laws and regulations. So you need to have ethical supply chain practices that push compliance. Whether it's from a law and regulation perspective, where there's labor rights, environmental rights, product safety, you want to keep pushing that. Then you want to promote social responsibility. So respecting sort of human rights, ethical supply chain management basically makes sure that you uphold human rights, whether it's a fair labor practice, safe working conditions, and also the elimination of child labor or forced labor. You want to be able to support communities like a CSR campaign. Then when we're looking at it from an environmental sustainability perspective, you want to reduce environmental impact. So when you have ethical supply chain practices, you want to be able to promote the sustainability. You want to be able to minimize any sort of resource consumption. You want to do, reduce your pollution, try and not contribute towards, massive climate change, that sort of thing. Then when we move on to risk, it's basically how can you best mitigate risks relating to supplier reliability or natural disasters, how best can you build some sort of resilience, basically. Then when we say creating a competitive advantage, it can basically differentiate between various different companies or businesses within different industries. They attract different customers. Some customers value sustainability. Some customers value social responsibility. Some have ethical sourcing. How best can you now attract talent as well? People that want to work for your organization, their values align with your values and your ethics. You want to be able to improve your employee retention and improve your satisfaction. And then lastly, how can you improve efficiency and collaboration? You want to optimize your processes within your supply chain. You want to be able to reduce waste. You want to have better resource allocation or resource utilization, and also push collaboration as much as possible, especially between different stakeholders, whether it's your supplier, whether it's your manufacturer, whether it's an executive committee. You want to be able to get stronger partnerships so that there's better decision making. You've got a better value creation at the end. Okay. And then the last one is we want to look at some of the benefits and some of the challenges. So when we look at it from a benefits perspective, we want to look at it in terms of, sorry, just lost my train of thought there. What is the different visions? What is the different goals that, the business, decides from an ethical perspective, that they're going to set? Is your leadership now involved in this? How best can you, when you have better ethics, you have better infrastructure, people want to buy from you. You also follow, legal and compliance fairly well due to that. And then some of the challenges in your supply chain then becomes like your producer, your supplier, your retailer, your consumer, because corruption exists. And, if you also try and uphold ethics as much as possible, there can be some, cultural disputes or religious disputes or industry-related disputes. So you want to try and keep that leadership and accountability as much as possible. So when your ethics sort of lapses, it stems from a lack of ethical leadership, accountability. You have a lot of oversight within the business. So you need to be as resilient as possible. And yeah, corruption basically, it does have the potential to cause devastating harm to your business, to the community, to the society. And, it can be in the form of like kickbacks, maybe suppliers who evade, law enforcement, whether it's, you've got like pyramid schemes happening, or they have licensing laws that they're evading. All of these things can fall part of your challenges. When we're looking at it from a retailer perspective, some retailers basically resort to some practices like tampering with packaging or partially filling some items. This is basically cheating your customers out. Your consumer, they sometimes buy counterfeit products that's priced much cheaper. So, this affects your business at the end of the day. And then from a supplier perspective, they obviously play quite an important role in your production process for your business. So you integrate a lot of the procurement for high level raw materials. You want to maintain high standards, especially from an inventory perspective. You want to be able to provide a good distribution setting. So when you have sort of like lower standards, because you want to save some costs and increase your profit, it can have a disadvantage for the business and the organization. Okay, and that basically brings us to the end of our ethics portion of the business. So as I said, it was fairly, fairly short. I did upload the slides already, and I will go ahead and upload the recording. And on Thursday, we will basically do a quick session on sort of what to focus on. Okay, thank you.